Thanks so much. I appreciate everyone coming out, and just want to especially thank Andy and Kelly and the fellow participants in the Continuum Scholars Program. Had a wonderful time together in May, and just appreciate the support from the college for the program. Let me get my thing. All right, it works. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about my vocational journey. You heard a little bit about it in the introduction, but I'll add a little bit to that. And then we'll talk about one area of my research, which is the intersection of religion and adoption. So I'll talk about one of my very first studies at this intersection, which was looking at religious motivations to adopt and how that impacted families and kids. We'll talk a bit about a larger scale study I did with a collaborator on religiosity and religious affiliation among adoptive parents, and like how that predicted their propensity to adopt. And then we'll end with a study about adult adoptees and their experiences growing up in religious settings. So I tried to pick some of the best architecture at the places that I worked at or learned at along the way. So the brain just represents that early interest in neuroscience and just science in general and math. Started college as a math major, but it was really that intro psych professor that using Dave's book that really helped me fall in love with psych. At Calvin, I had a set of really wonderful experiences and just loved that Christian higher ed experience, that holistic kind of care that I experienced. And it was really the experiential learning opportunities that I had there at Rush Presbyterian up at the top, and then on the left at Children's Specialized Hospital of Michigan, where it really helped me as an undergrad even see what was possible in terms of future careers and really explore those options of working in an academic medical center. That's what I thought I was going to do when I went to graduate school, work at a hospital like so many of my neuropsychologist mentors had before me. But my time at Wayne State and the teaching that I got to do during that time was really formative. And I thought, I like this teaching thing kind of more than I expected I would. And part of my time when I was at Wayne, I was working at that very colorful building, Children's Hospital of Michigan in Detroit. And that's where I did all my clinical and research training in grad school. One of the lines of research at the Pet Center that I worked there was on supporting kids who are coming out of institutional care. So this was the early 2000s, and there was a lot of kids being internationally adopted. So just a little bit of kind of context. This is drawing from data across a lot of different sources, because in the US we don't really carefully track adoptions all in one way. But the bottom line there is international adoptions. And so, I'm talking, this is I'm right about here in grad school. So you can see the peak of international adoptions was the early 2000s. It has since decreased quite a bit. But because this was a growing practice and so many kids were coming, there was a lot of interest in figuring out how we could better support kids who were coming out of institutional care settings who had experienced a lot of deprivation in their early experiences. You can see, just while we're here, you can see this red line here is domestic foster adoption in the US, which has been fairly steady, maybe a little bit up recently, and then private adoption is not tracked as in the same way, but this purple line here tries to capture it from some census data and that sort of thing. So that's how I first got into adoption research, was in graduate school. And it brought together some of my personal family experiences with adoption. I'm not an adoptee, but I have several family members who are, and my best friend growing up was. And so it felt like I could do research on a topic that also had personal relevance to people that I really cared about. And so I headed off to my 1 year of clinical residency at University of Chicago. it had really, really nice architecture. And I worked at their international adoption clinic there. That was one of my roles there was again, doing developmental assessments for kids and supporting families as kids were coming out of institutional care. You heard I headed off to Calvin and now to Hope, so that's the end of my architecture tour. But while I was at Calvin, the first study that I want to talk about was kicked off. So you can go back in time with me a little bit. I was really interested in still the cognitive development of kids who were coming out of early deprivation settings. That was kind of my initial motivation to start studying adoption when I was at Calvin. And adoption, international adoption especially, was changing a lot as I was, this is now we're at 2010, so international adoption's dropping in frequency, and the kinds of kids that are coming are different too. They were they were older, they had often disabilities as a part of their care needs and that sort of thing. And there was a lot of research focused on kids who were adopted as infants, but not as much on kids coming at older ages. So that was how the study originally was developed. I was studying kids longitudinally for about 6 years, and as just a side part of that project, I thought, why don't we ask about the motivations that families had for adopting in the first place? And we'll do that the first wave that they come to see me. The kids have just joined the home, and then we can look at how those motivations impact things over time. It wasn't the core question of the study, but it was kind of a side thing that we had some data on, and it turned out to be really like such an interesting line of research. So just a little bit of backstory on motivations to adopt, especially religious motivations. When you ask adoptive parents, what led them to adopt, there's often many, many motivations at play at the same time. But a significant minority describe religious motivations, something like maybe I felt God directing me or God calling me to pursue this, those kinds of things. So if you look at other research, I'm happy to send you stuff if you're interested, but about 10 to maybe some studies find 30% of parents talk about having these religious motivations, among other motivations that they have going on. And religious motivations have been linked to choices that parents make in the adoption process. So they tend to, higher religious motivations are linked with adopting kids with more support needs. It makes people more likely to adopt transracially, research has found. There's also some research on how religious motivations are linked with outcomes for kids and families, and the findings are incredibly mixed. So you have some studies that say higher religious motivations predict good outcomes for parents, like lower parent stress and better parent mood outcomes. And then other studies find no relationship at all, that like kid outcomes, parent outcomes, attachment are really unrelated to whether people have religious motivations or not. So there wasn't a ton of research, and so we felt like our longitudinal work could kind of speak to that. This bigger study that this is drawn from followed 44 kids for 6 years. We had a very religious sample, so like keep that in mind relative to other studies. So 86% of our families had some sort of religious affiliation, although variability in like how engaged they were in that. So the way that we assessed religious motivation is we asked them to rank all different kinds of motivations that they could have for adopting. And they could rank them like first, second, third. And then once they chose the ones that they ranked, we asked them to assign a percentage to it. How much of this motivation, out of your 100% total motivation, how much does this one motivation play a role? And so this data focuses just on the folks who ranked religious motivation and gave some sort of percentage to it. But you can see on the left, a lot of our participants endorsed religious motivation, about 70%. 45%, it was their top motivation. So we had a very religious sample. When we asked them what percent of the 100% of their motivation it included, average was about 50% of their motivation. And then we were able to take that percentage, like how much of this is your motivation, and look at how it predicted things over the 6 years that we were doing this study. And we found that it did predict decisions that parents made in adopting. So when folks had a higher religious motivation, they were adopting older children. They were adopting children, more likely to adopt children with disabilities or greater care needs. They also had a larger family size total. And so what we were seeing often is folks with religious motivation often had biological children and then adopted additional children after that, sometimes when their biological children were quite a bit older. And so we were just finding this trend in religious motivation being linked to family size, family makeup. We also looked at how it impacted their parenting. This is self-described, like parent rating kinds of things. And we found that the higher religious motivation was linked with firmer discipline practices, more consistent discipline practices, less permissive. And there's a paper right now, and we haven't quite finished analyzing the data, but we're also looking at like specific practices like timeout and spanking and stuff like that. So hang on, I'll have more data on that coming up. The other piece that we looked at was outcomes. And we really, across all our outcomes over all 6 years, religious motivation did not seem to predict those outcomes, whether it was how kids were doing, how parents were doing, how the relationship or attachment. There was really no relationship that we could discern. Now, some of that might be we have a small sample size and a very religious, where set of folks, maybe we'd see more if we had more variability on our religion variable. But it seemed like when we controlled for wave 1, meaning like how kids were behaving and functioning at wave 1, how parents were behaving and functioning, that was really the strongest predictor of how they were 6 years later, rather than the specific motivations that they had. So that was, again, my kind of first attempt at studying this intersection of religion and adoption. Then, when that was kind of wrapping up, I was ready for my first sabbatical, which was such a gift. Man, I love those sabbaticals. And so I was like trying to think of a bigger project that I could do. And also I wanted to do more interdisciplinary work. That was another kind of vocational call. I was feeling like I need to work with people outside my discipline, like the kind of questions I have, I can't answer by myself, that sort of thing. And so I started collaborating with Alicia Marr, who's a good friend and a sociologist, and we, along with one other collaborator for all our sabbaticals, co-edited the Rutledge Handbook of Adoption. And as part of that handbook, Alicia and I co-wrote a chapter on religion and adoption and analyzed some new data together. So this question that we had about religion and adoption and motivations to adopt, we could look at it in our small sample of 44, but we wanted to okay, what if we zoom out? And here the sociologist lens was super helpful. What are some big data sets where we can look at large, population level kinds of trends? And so the chapter and Alicia and I's work focused on religiosity and people's propensity to adopt. People had looked at this before, and they had tended to find that religious affiliation, or how important people rate religion, how frequently they attend religious services, that those things predict steps to adoption. So like considering it, maybe talking with a lawyer or visiting and getting information from an adoption agency, that kind of thing. But it didn't tend to predict actually completing the adoption necessarily. And that the link between religious affiliation and taking steps to adopt was strongest among white women and less so among women of color. At the same time as this was all going, a very influential book, at least for me and other adoption researchers, came out. Samuel Perry wrote Growing God's Family, and it was a sociologist's take on the evangelical orphan care movement. So it was looking at this evangelical push to adopt as a as a part of a religious call. And it was kind of assessing whether that orphan care movement, like what impact it actually had. So that was he was analyzing some of the same data. And then the adoption, it's the National Survey of Adoptive Parents came out, and it reported that 78% of adopted kids are attending religious services, compared to 70% in the US. So all of this data was pointing to, like, there are some large-scale trends here linking religion and adoption. So what we did is we analyzed data from the National Survey of Family Growth, which it focuses on women in particular, and asks about different steps that they might have taken to have or not have biological children or to adopt. So it is a large-scale study. We also analyzed some data from General Social Survey, because one of Alicia and I's question was, is the shift in the way that people are religiously affiliated and adopting, is that due to just general shifts in changes in how people are affiliated in the US, increases or decreases in people who affiliate as Protestant or Catholic? Is it just driven by national trends, or is there something more going on? So small numbers, I promise I'll kind of highlight something. So the data from the National Survey of Family Growth gave us percentages over time of adoptive mothers and their religious affiliation. And so back in 1995, you have about 50% adoptive mothers who are Protestant, and the last data that we could analyze from 2015, it was up to 72%. You saw a reduction in the number of Catholic adoptive mothers over that 20-year span, and although a dip back up for other religious affiliation or no religious affiliation. So we were seeing these kind of trends where more Protestant women were adopting. But that could just be because of general trends in the US. So we looked at the General Social Survey, and we saw trends in different directions for Protestantism and for Catholicism relative to what we saw in the adoption data. So then we did a comparison between the two, right? If we were kind of looking to see if certain religious groups were overrepresented among adoptive mothers relative to how they were represented at the population. And we found that that was the case, especially at the last data point we could look at, where 24% there was that 24% difference between adoptive mothers who were Protestant and then Protestant women in the US. So we're really seeing this overrepresentation and kind of underrepresentation of Catholic adoptive parents and no religious affiliation. So there's a lot of explanations for that. One might be the evangelical orphan care movement really is pushing for more adoption from Protestants. Another line that another explanation is a lot of adoption agencies are religiously affiliated, and many of them are Protestant affiliations. And so maybe the folks who have no religious affiliation have some barriers or just are not recruited in the same way as adoptive parents. Neil from Econ here and I are in brainstorming stage about how we could do a study to look at that. So again, this my kind of another attempt at religion and adoption, but this time interdisciplinary. All right. So as I was leaving Calvin and coming to Hope, I was noticing vocationally that I was feeling a little disillusioned with publishing only in academic journals where some of the people that I would really want to read the research are never gonna see it. Kind of disillusioned with some of the adoption research I was seeing that sort of felt kind of overly pathologizing to adoptees. And even when I considered some of the research I had done as a newbie graduate student, I thought, I I needed a change in terms of what I was focusing on and how I was studying things. And so this study, I was kind of just collecting the data as I was coming to Hope, and I've done a lot of analysis in it since. So I'm really excited about this project. It also represents a focus I want to have on collaborating with adoptees in this work. And so this study in particular, all of my collaborators but one, like out of 10 of us, in the group are adoptees. And so I just think there's a lot of richness to this work when it's adoption research done by adoptees. So this project that we've been working on has tried to look at what are the experiences of adult adoptees who grew up in Christian adoptive homes. Most of the research, like when I had to write that chapter on religion and adoption, most of it has focused on adoptive parents' experiences. And so there is some research to look at religious meaning making that adoptive parents might do, like the ways that they see their adoption experience reflecting their faith or interconnected with their faith. And it comes up with themes that are, listed here. So adoptive parents talk about their adoption as like ministry, or linking physical adoption with spiritual adoption, extending blessings. They feel blessed by God and they want to extend those blessings to a child, or they feel like the evangelical orphan care movement, at least originally, talked about this idea of a spiritual mandate to care for orphans. And then a lot of adoptive parents talk about better understanding aspects of their own faith through their adoption experience. So there's a lot of, well, I wouldn't say a lot. There's like a small group of studies that have looked at this, but really nothing at the adoptee experience. So we were trying to kind of fill that gap. We interviewed 41 adoptees who were raised in Christian homes, some of whom continue to affiliate and attend and rank religion as quite important, and others less so. And we were wanting to ask them about the memorable messages that they heard about adoption and religion growing up. So memorable messages, there's a whole side literature, side quest on that. But those are the messages often that kids hear from important grown-ups in their life that they hold on to. So those are phrases that you remember, and maybe you do retrospective sense making in response to those. One of my collaborators on this study is a communication scholar, so and an expert in memorable messages. So she helped with the backstory on that. So this is the list of the messages that we heard from our participants. They're listed in order from most common to least common. So we heard things from our participants like, I was told I was chosen by God for our family, or that my adoption was part of God's plan, that God saved or rescued me from a bad situation, that I was a gift or a blessing from God to my parents. We heard a lot of the all adopted by God connections between spiritual adoption and their adoption. I won't keep kind of reading them down, but here's one quote from a participant that I think illustrates this pretty well. It says, "I think the primary message that I received from church, it was in connection with this general idea of we are all adopted. We are both God's children, and we are adopted into his family. But I think the language around it was then we are helpless, we are in need, and someone came to save us." So you hear a couple themes in there, the saved, rescued, the all adopted by God. Those kinds of messages are what kids are hearing. And when you look back at the literature on adoptive parents and their religious meaning making, you can draw some arrows between the memorable messages that adults report hearing as kids and what adoptive parents are talking about in their own religious processing of their adoption experience. So then we asked our participants, tell us more about how you remember thinking about those messages as kids. There's always some drawbacks, right? Because retrospective, reporting is colored by, current experiences. And then we asked them, how do you think about them now? The most common childhood interpretation that our participants made was accepting the messages. Like, I'm hearing them, and so I receive them, and of course this is true, like, we believe what our parents tell us, or what other important adults tell us. A smaller number of our participants reported as kids feeling some discomfort around some of the messages, not all of them, but some particular ones, and that they felt like they couldn't maybe share that discomfort because they needed to comply or please adoptive parents. They felt as though if they said anything, that would kind of rock the boat. There's also participants who reported that the messages made them question their belonging, and this is one example of that from a participant. You know the song where it's Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. And the church members would literally point at me and be like, the world. And because I was the world, apparently I wasn't a part of this church. I was brought into this church. So I was like a perpetual foreigner within my own church. And being in that kind of position as a pastor's daughter just kind of compounded on it. So that's like an example of what our participants talked about with the kind of questioning belonging piece. As an adult, we tended to see that kind of the most common interpretation was that the messages didn't make room for some of the grief, loss that adult adoptees were feeling as a part of their adoption experience. So things like messages like you should be grateful, or God saved you from this bad situation. Those kinds of messages felt like, yeah, but also there's more. My adoption experience for our participants was complicated, and there was duality to it, and the messages didn't always leave room for that, processing that or talking about that. Even among our participants who were very religious and had great relationships with their adoptive family. Other interpretations are listed there, so negative views about their first family. So if I'm saved and rescued from this horrible thing, like, what does that say about my birth or biological family? Some of them felt as though it didn't leave room for them. It more centered their adoptive parents' experiences. A smaller number we coded as reconciling, meaning they kept aspects and held on to aspects of the messages and felt that they were had positive experiences with them. And then some of them felt like, my parents or the church did the best they could with what they had, and so we coded that as benefit of the doubt. So take-home point is there are a very diverse range of interpretations of these messages, both as kids and adults. And it was not aligning very clearly with any demographic things, meaning it wasn't that all the people who had left the church were having these negative reactions and those who had stayed had positive. It was very nuanced and complicated how these messages mapped on to different people's experiences. So a really wide variety. The end of the interview asked them about the impacts in different areas, and we're just, this paper's under review, so the video will hopefully by the time that comes out, we'll have an answer. But the areas we looked at were emotional impacts of hearing the messages, identity impacts, relationship impacts, and religiosity. And we saw, again, this complicated set of impacts. We had more participants who had negative emotional impacts that they described, but still a smaller group, maybe about 5 out of our 40 participants, who felt like those messages were comforting, or they held the messages in tension with other things. Identity impacts were ranging. We had some participants who said these messages were a real barrier to my identity development. This quote is an example of that. In response to the all adopted by God messaging, one participant said, "It's made its impact. I think because it made it harder for me to figure out my identity. I think because of putting white God, white Jesus into the white culture, it really messed with my head about who I am. Because if we're made in his image, then I don't look like him. Then who am I? And so this was a transracially adopted participant who grew up in a white church and felt like the religious messages they heard made their racial identity hard to work through. As adults, a lot of participants reported that they were working on reclaiming aspects of their identity in response to messages. And then a smaller group of participants said, hey, those messages that I heard as kids, the way my parents used them really helped celebrate my identity and acknowledge diversity. So we have this huge range in our participants of like how the messages were used, how they're received. Relationship-wise, we had a good chunk of participants who felt like, I don't agree with these messages and I don't want to talk about that with my parents, so I just kind of compartmentalize. We have a good relationship as long as we don't just talk about that stuff. So that was the compartmentalization group. We had a small group of participants who were estranged from their adoptive family and blamed in part some of the messaging and the way things had been communicated religiously. And then we had some participants who said, those messages I heard as kids strengthened my relationship with my adoptive family, deepened it. And then in religiosity, the findings are pretty similar to relationships. We had some who are kind of, I don't agree with these religious messages, but I still go to church. I hold on to parts of my faith. It's kind of like a deconstruction, reconstruction maybe group. We had some who had left the faith, and then a smaller group who felt like these messages like helped my faith, solidified my faith. So take-home point is this is really, really varied, and that the way that people make sense of the messages is probably more important than the words of the message. So the sense-making part of it is really key to how these messages are received and the impacts that they have over time. At the same time, I think this research can really help religious communities who are wanting to be places of belonging for adoptees and think about how things are communicated and the way that could be done in a supportive way. I want to wrap this up with a quote from Kelly Nicodeha. She is both an adoptee and an adoptive parent. So she wrote a really beautiful book called Adopted, The Sacrament of Belonging in a Fractured World. She's also a pastor, and so I just really enjoy a lot of her writing. So she says, adoption is complicated, as familiar with heartache as with hospitality, and over time stripped of all heroics, it can reveal humble truths. Belonging isn't easy or guaranteed. There are 100 ways it can go wrong, but there are as many ways as it can go right, as strangers are transformed into relatives. Family formation is always a risk, but a worthy one. That's why we wrestle and contend for the blessings, as Jacob did in Genesis, to know the sacrament of belonging. This is how adoption works, like a sacrament, that visible sign of an inner grace. It's a thin place where we see that we are different and yet not entirely foreign to one another. We are relatives not by blood, but by mystery. And I just, I feel as though I am not an adopted person, and yet I've learned so much from adoptee speakers and thought leaders, some of whom are pictured here. I was doing a lot of this work at a time where I was bringing up a lot of questions that I had for myself about suffering and the meaning of suffering, and I had gone through some pregnancy losses and been working clinically with kids who had experienced really horrific abuse, and just asking God a lot of these questions of why do you allow this to happen? And I felt like the adoptees that I was reading and engaging with their work really had some wisdom to share about some of these ideas of meaning and suffering, and how to hold duality, like two opposing things can be true at the very same time and they don't cancel each other out. I felt like listening to them and reading some of their work really helped me understand that in my own faith and context. So I'm really grateful. These are, if you want, these are all clickable links, so if you're interested in exploring any of these folks, highly recommend their work. Jade Hennis was the collaborator on the Memorable Messages project in particular. So, all right, I think I got through what I wanted. I'd love to hear if there's any questions.
We have just one mic here, so I'll do some ferrying it back and forth. But thank you, Dr. Heller, for that. Questions? We definitely have some time for that. Yes, Dr. Myers.
Thank you, Emily. I'm really interested in the larger question of the association between religious engagement and altruistic behaviors, such as charitable giving and volunteerism. And there's a lot of data that indicates that, in fact, the commandment to think of others rather than just self and to love others is manifest, despite all the examples to the contrary. And so I'm really interested in your data about the association between religious engagement and adoption. For example, that people who are not religious nuns are more likely to adopt. Are there data? I mean, I know the General Social Survey asks not just whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or other, but will ask questions like how important is religion in your life, or frequency of worship or religious engagement or worship attendance. Have you seen any data, or I don't know if the General Social Survey asks an adoption question because it would allow this, that associates not just whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or none with adoption tendency or willingness, but how religiously engaged you are.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, some of the studies that are on that slide that talk about the past research have looked at the importance data and the frequency of service attendance. And the findings have been pretty similar to just looking at religious affiliation. When we analyzed it, we just looked at affiliation, but our hope is to update it and then also draw on some data where we could do importance and that kind of thing. Because some of the National Survey of Family Growth has started to ask some of those additional religious questions, so we'd be able to pull that data too. Yeah. And you have it from children. Yeah, from the national, that 78%, that's from the National Survey of Adoptive Parents. So it's asking the parents, like, do your kid, how often do they attend? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, they're connected. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one of my research students he wants to do a senior honors thesis, and our goal is to look at some existing big data sets that we might be able to mine for these kinds of questions, plus things he's interested in. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My mind is everywhere because I was trying to do comparative analysis on your presentation on adoption. I'm a religionist, so I had a lot of questions because I'm trying to see. I'm not very well versed with adoption here, but I'm trying to derive that from my indigenous culture as an African and also as an African Christian, what I've seen. First of all, in my culture, they value kinship, genealogy, the blood. Therefore, you'd find that while the indigenous cultures are very welcoming and open to strangers, the widows, the fatherless, because it resonates very well with the Old Testament, you'd find there is a reservation to take foreign blood because it's considered a taboo. I was a teacher at a high school Catholic boarding school where there is an orphanage. There are so many orphanages in my country. I come from Zimbabwe. So what happens is many individuals do not adopt the child. The children are at the children's home and they've got a mother. In my culture, everyone old is dad, his father, everyone old is mother, not apart from being biological. So we always say, good afternoon, mom, good afternoon, dad. So, but then when I decide to help, I go to the children's home, take the girl, the boy to my house, spoil or holidays, whatever, but they always go back because there's a sort of fear that it's a taboo to take somebody. I wanted to know how integrated are these adopted kids because here in Holland, I've often heard people saying, I adopted 2 kids from East Africa, Kenya adopted. And I say, where are they? Now they're grown up. I always said they will do what. This is where my question is. Is it for the sake of society where we have pressure that, it's good to do good? Is it emanating from purely religious convictions, from biblical truth, or we are moving with the global trend where I see claims of doing it from a religious perspective contradicts the motives behind?
Yeah, a couple things. So these, in our small group of participants that we did the interviews on, many had felt very integrated into their adoptive family and had very positive relationships with their adoptive family. I think in many places, there's a variety of different relationships that kids have with their parents, whether those are their birth parents or their adoptive parents. In terms of your question about kind of cultural differences, we should have lunch with Catherine and you and I. Catherine used to work in Africa in a couple different countries, looking at developing adoption and kinship care and family-based options, among other things. I have a chapter about it in Ethiopia that I could send you that looks at some of the ways that they used local indigenous culture and wisdom to develop family-based care options for kids so that they wouldn't have to, they could leave institutional care. For yeah. Why don't I hop in and I can just for the video that so the question is how much of motivation is religious and how much is other. I think Samuel Perry's book and others talk about this idea of vocabulary of motive, that maybe people have one motivation, but it's not socially acceptable to talk about it, and so they use different vocabulary to talk about the motive. So I think there are people doing research on that question. At the same time, I think the research on motivation to adopt or motivation to foster is pretty well established, and most of that finds there are a wide for each person, there are multiple motivations usually working at the same time. Some of them are maybe more self-motivated. Some of them are more other-motivated, even within the same person. Yeah.
Thank you. Love the thought around how within religious communities we're thinking about messaging and how powerful that is for the adoptees that you talk to. I'm wondering if there's any work out there on memorable messages that aren't within religious communities and what you know about that in terms of outcomes or meaning making.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting parts of doing that project for me, was diving into that research, because there's just a ton. There's a lot around memorable messages around health communication. There's a lot of that, of things you heard as kids growing up and how that impacts health behaviors. A lot of it around mental health, around sexual behaviors, what kids hear from parents or important adults and how that impacts things later. There's some memorable messages around grief that I think are connected, where, you know, the kinds of things people hear after they have a loss and how those memorable messages help or don't help. And a lot of that research was really influential for our study because it had that same flavor of the content of the message is less important than how people like make sense of and like wrestle with the message, that is a stronger predictor of outcomes than like the words. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more here to Lauren.
Mine sort of piggybacks a bit on Lindsay's question, but I guess I was wondering, especially because you had up here like the stats on 78% of adopted children attend religious services, but also 70% of just U.S. children in general. To me, I was actually surprised. I was like, that's a very high statistic. So I guess I'm wondering, again, I appreciate that you're doing the work on religious children's and then as adult, like their perspectives, but I am curious about the broader population, kind of like base rates of like, how often do children in general in religiously affiliated households hear messages like, God put you in this family, whether it's through adoption or not? And especially because you were talking about sense making, in that context where there's not adoption, like, would it have the same impacts, or would it change the way that that's received and therefore have maybe opposite impacts? Or I don't know if you have done any work on that.
I haven't done work on that, and we looked hard for research on that and couldn't find anything either. That's the kind of the next study that I'm hoping to do is a larger scale quantitative one where we can look at adoptees into Christian adoptive homes, Jewish, we can compare, and then also have some comparison groups of non-adopted folks reflecting on the messages they heard about their kind of role in the family or their place in the family. So yeah, that's on the wish list.